Rain threaded the London dawn in thin, needling lines, turning the cobblestones before Harrington House into a darkened mirror where shame might see its own reflection. The carriage that stopped beneath the portico bore no crest, no driver in livery, only discretion. From it descended Eliza Hartwell, a maid of 22 years, her gloved hands clasped so tightly at her waist that the knuckles pressed white through kid leather. She walked as one who had been carefully mended and yet feared she might come apart at the next breath. Within the house, fires had already been lit against the chill, but warmth did not soften the air. Servants moved in subdued currents, their murmurs dissolving when she entered. The butler inclined his head without meeting her eyes. The scullery maid paused in her scrubbing and stared openly, as if expecting some visible mark upon Eliza's brow. There was none. Only pallor and a steadiness that cost her everything. 6 weeks. That was all the time her body had known its secret before she had unmade it. The physician's rooms had been clean and soundless, the curtains drawn, the instructions spoken in tones of professional mercy. She had not wept there. She had saved her tears for later, when the carriage rocked her back through streets that pretended not to notice her passage. Now, crossing the threshold of Harrington House, she felt the ache of absence more keenly than any physical pain, as though she had left behind not merely a possibility, but a version of herself who might have been braver. "Miss Hartwell," the housekeeper said, her voice ironed flat. "You have been indisposed." "Yes, madam." "A lady's indispositions are best kept private." Eliza bowed her head. Privacy had been the very reason for her errand. It had been purchased at a price she dared not calculate. She resumed her duties without protest, polishing silver until her reflection stared back at her in distorted fragments. In each curved surface she saw a different expression: fear, resolve, something like relief. She had chosen silence over spectacle. In a city that devoured fallen women, she had chosen survival. The master of the house had been abroad for weeks, called away on matters of estate and parliament, so the footmen said. His absence had been a mercy and a torment. Mercy because no one could accuse him of knowledge. Torment because knowledge had once rested between them like a fragile porcelain cup, handled with care and set aside too quickly. She remembered a night of rain not unlike this one, when grief had softened his reserve and loneliness had loosened her caution. It had not been a seduction but a solace, a single hour when rank dissolved and two human beings met without witness. In the days that followed, propriety returned with brutal efficiency. He departed at dawn for the north. She remained with a secret beneath her apron and a dread beneath her ribs. When her courses failed, she counted the weeks with trembling arithmetic. When the nausea came, she folded linen with hands that would not steady. No promise had been made between them, none could have been spoken without detonating the world they inhabited. And so she had walked alone into that quiet clinic, determined that no man's future should be tethered to her ruin. By afternoon, the household's whispers had ripened into conjecture. "Such girls seldom recover their standing," one maid murmured, loud enough to be heard. Eliza lifted a tray and carried it past them with measured grace. Dignity, she had learned, was a posture one maintained even when the spine threatened collapse. She would not offer them a spectacle. Toward evening, a letter arrived bearing a familiar seal. The butler's composure fractured for a heartbeat before it reassembled. "His lordship returns tonight," he announced. The word struck like a bell tolling through her veins. She felt neither hope nor dread at first, only a vast stillness as though the air itself waited to see what she would do. She did what she had always done. She lit candles in the study, set fresh ink upon the desk, arranged the decanters with quiet precision. When the door opened and he entered, rain following him in a dark sheen upon his coat, she did not look up. Yet she felt his presence as one feels a change in weather, subtle, inescapable. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Your lordship." The distance between those two phrases contained an ocean. She withdrew before her composure betrayed her, retreating into corridors where portraits of ancestors gazed down with impassive judgment. The house seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Night gathered. Tasks concluded. The servants dispersed. Eliza passed the study once more on her way to extinguish the hall lamps. The door stood nearly closed, light slipping through the narrow seam. Within she heard his voice, low, restrained, speaking not to the room but to someone unseen. "I was not told," he said. A pause heavy as a verdict. Then, more quietly still, "The child was mine." The word struck with the clarity of a bell shattering glass. Her hand tightened upon the lamp she carried, flame wavering dangerously. In that instant, shame shifted into something sharper, more perilous than grief. "He knew," he claimed. and beyond the thin barrier of oak, the future trembled, waiting to decide them both. Morning broke with brittle clarity, as though the night's confession had scoured the sky clean. Eliza descended the servants' staircase with a composure so deliberate it bordered on defiance. If he knew, the knowledge had not yet detonated the household. Silver clinked, kettles hissed, and the ordinary machinery of respectability resumed its hum. Yet beneath that order lay a new current, electric and unseen, threading from the study to the scullery and settling most perilously in her chest. He entered the breakfast room precisely at 9. Lord Harrington wore restraint as other men wore cologne. It preceded him. His dark hair, still damp from his bath, caught the light like polished walnut. He did not look at her immediately, and the omission felt as intentional as any touch. Eliza poured his coffee with a hand that did not tremble. When at last his gaze lifted, it rested upon her not as a master appraising a servant, but as a man measuring consequence. "Miss Hartwell," he said, the syllables even. "My lord." No other word passed between them, yet something had shifted. The distance remained, but it was no longer empty. It thrummed with what he had claimed behind the door. By noon, a folded square of ivory linen appeared beside the basin where she scrubbed crystal. It was of finer quality than any allotted to the staff, edged with a discreet monogram. She recognized it at once. She had laundered such handkerchiefs with care. No note accompanied it, no explanation. The gift was not romantic. It was protective, an offering of gentility against the abrasion of gossip. She hesitated before slipping it into her pocket, aware that acceptance could be interpreted as complicity. The household did not miss the alteration in atmosphere. A footman lingered too long in the corridor when Lord Harrington paused to inquire after the inventory she carried. An elderly aunt, newly arrived from Bath, surveyed Eliza with narrowed eyes and a smile sharpened by lineage. "Your staff grows bold," the lady observed over luncheon, her gaze fixed upon the maid's retreating back. "Familiarity is a contagion." "My household values loyalty," he replied without inflection. "It would be foolish to punish it." The words traveled faster than any carriage. By afternoon, whispers ripened into suspicion. Eliza felt them brush her shoulders like cobwebs she dared not disturb. She could endure censure. She could not endure the notion that he might suffer for her sake. The arithmetic of class was merciless. A gentleman might indulge a mistake. He could not marry one without forfeiting comfort and kin. As twilight approached, she found a slim volume of verse resting upon the side table in the anteroom, its ribbon marker tucked with quiet precision. She opened it despite herself. The page bore a stanza underlined in faint graphite, a meditation on loss and on the courage required to name it. The gesture was intimate in its restraint. He would not speak openly. He would place meaning where only she would discover it. When he encountered her in the corridor beyond the conservatory, the scent of damp earth clinging to the air, he halted. Glass panes trembled faintly in the wind, casting fractured light across his features. "You are pale," he said, and the concern beneath the observation was undisguised. "I am quite restored, my lord." Restoration implies injury. She met his gaze then, compelled by the steadiness in it. "Some injuries are self-inflicted. And some are shared," he returned, softly enough that the words belonged only to them. A door opened at the far end of the hall. Footsteps intruded. The moment sealed itself shut. Yet the acknowledgement lingered, a fragile bridge spanning the gulf they had pretended did not exist. That evening, guests arrived for a modest supper. Candles multiplied in the drawing room, their flames casting a gilded conspiracy upon silk and satin. Eliza moved through the company as invisibly as protocol demanded, replenishing glasses, adjusting chairs. She felt his attention like a hand at her back, guiding, guarding. When a gentleman remarked, within her hearing, that certain servants mistook proximity for privilege, Lord Harrington set down his glass with deliberate care. "Proximity does not confer privilege," he said, his tone mild. "It confers responsibility." The room quieted. His aunt's fan snapped shut. Eliza's pulse thundered in her ears. He had not named her, yet he had drawn a boundary no one could mistake. As the evening thinned and cloaks were fetched, he did what no master should. Standing near the threshold, within full view of departing guests, he inclined his head toward her. "Miss Hartwell," he said clearly, "your devotion to this household has been invaluable." Silence followed, delicate and explosive. Praise, offered thus, was a currency too costly to spend without intention. She felt the weight of every gaze, the arithmetic recalculating in real time. Gratitude would appear presumptuous. Refusal would seem insolent. She curtsied with measured grace. "I endeavor to be worthy of my position, my lord." "Worth is not always assigned by position," he replied. The door closed behind the final carriage. The chandeliers dimmed. In the hush that remained, she understood that his gestures were no accident. They were declarations rendered in code. Each one tethered him more tightly to her, and each one sharpened the blade of scandal poised above them. From the shadowed landing, his aunt watched with unblinking calculation. "Are you courting ruin?" she asked him, her voice low but unyielding. He did not lower his gaze. "I am correcting an injustice." The words hung in the air, bright as a struck match. Eliza felt their heat from across the hall, and with it the peril they invited. Correction required confession. Injustice required naming. And somewhere beyond the decorous walls of Harrington House, London waited hungrily for a story. The storm arrived just after dusk, rolling over London with a low, sovereign growl that rattled the panes of Harrington House and drove the servants to secure every latch. Rain lashed the windows in silver sheets, blurring the lamplit street beyond into a trembling wash of gold. Within, the corridors darkened as though the house itself recoiled from what it sheltered. Eliza carried a stack of mended linens toward the upper chambers, each step measured, each breath carefully portioned, as if composure were a finite resource. She had not seen him since the evening's declaration. His words, correction, injustice, had echoed through her thoughts like a persistent tolling bell. They were bold, perilous words, and she understood the gravity of boldness in a world constructed upon restraint. If he intended to defend her publicly, he would not merely risk censure. He would imperil alliances, inheritance, comfort. She had sacrificed a child to preserve his future. She would not see that future squandered in a gesture of romantic defiance. A crack of thunder split the sky. The house quivered. Somewhere below, a door opened and closed with urgency. Eliza descended toward the library, compelled by a restlessness she could neither name nor resist. The corridor lay dim, the sconces guttering in draughts that whispered along the walls. She paused before the half-open door, the scent of old leather and extinguished fire drifting outward like a memory. He stood by the hearth, though no flame burned there. Shadows cut sharp lines across his face, carving it into something sterner, more vulnerable than she had known. His coat had been cast aside. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the forearm, revealing a man stripped of ceremony. He did not turn at her entrance, yet he knew she was there. "You should not wander during a storm," he said quietly. "I am accustomed to unsettled weather, my lord. Not all tempests are survivable." She set the linens upon a chair and clasped her hands before her. "I did not come for shelter." Silence expanded between them, dense and charged. The rain struck harder, as if determined to drown the unspoken. At last he faced her fully. There was no hauteur in his expression now, no curated indifference. Only a gravity that acknowledged what had passed and what remained unresolved. "You heard me," he said. "Yes." "And you believe I spoke in error?" "I believe," she replied, summoning steadiness, "that acknowledgement does not alter consequence." His jaw tightened. "Consequence is precisely what I intend to alter." The words landed with controlled force. She felt their impact in the hollow beneath her ribs. "By what means?" "By claiming what was mine." The simplicity of it unsettled her more than any elaborate promise. "You speak as though society will acquiesce to sentiment." "I do not require its acquiescence." "You require its tolerance," she countered, and the boldness of her own tone startled her. "A gentleman does not thrive in exile." He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until the air felt insufficient. "Do you imagine I thrive now?" Lightning flared, illuminating them in stark relief. She saw, perhaps for the first time, the fissure beneath his composure, the regret he carried like an heirloom. "You had a choice," she said softly. "I chose for you, and deprived me of the right to stand beside you." The accusation was gentle, yet it struck true. She had acted alone, convinced that solitude was nobler than entanglement. "I feared you would deny me. I would have defied them." "Them," she repeated, and in that single syllable lay lineage, parliament, expectation. "You are not merely a man. You are a name. And you are not merely a servant." The assertion hovered, fragile and incendiary. She felt its heat creep across her skin. "I am precisely that." "No," he said more urgently than before. "You were a woman who offered kindness when I had none to spare. You were courage disguised as obedience." Her composure faltered. "Do not romanticize necessity." "I do not." His voice softened. "I regret my silence." The confession shifted the air. Regret was not a currency men of his standing spent lightly. She studied him, searching for calculation, for the polished rhetoric of a practiced aristocrat. She found instead an unvarnished sincerity that unsettled her defenses. "What do you seek?" she asked. "Redress." "For what?" "For abandoning you to fear." She felt the truth of it settle between them, heavy yet clarifying. The storm outside began to wane, its fury subsiding into a steady rain. Within the library the tension altered, no longer a clash but a convergence. "You cannot restore what I relinquished," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I can restore what you risked." Her breath caught. "My reputation is beyond restoration." "Then let mine be the scaffold upon which yours is rebuilt." The audacity of the declaration left her momentarily speechless. To tether his honor to hers was no small gesture. It was a recalibration of hierarchy. "You would bind yourself to scandal. I would bind myself to truth." She felt the world tilt. Truth, in their sphere, was often subordinate to appearance. To elevate it was an act bordering on rebellion. "You do not comprehend the cruelty that will follow." "I comprehend it precisely," he replied. "I have watched it all my life." A faint tremor entered her hands. She clasped them tighter. "And you would endure it for me?" "For us." The pronoun altered everything. It drew a line from that solitary night to this charged moment, weaving them into a single narrative rather than parallel missteps. She sensed the precipice before them, the irreversible step that awaited. "If you proceed," she said carefully, "there will be no retreat." "I have never retreated from what is mine," he answered, the words resonant with both claim and vow. The fire in the grate caught suddenly, a delayed ignition from the embers he had not realized still lived. Flame unfurled upward, casting warmth into the room and painting his features in amber light. She saw not merely a lord defending his estate, but a man choosing his allegiance. Outside, the storm receded into distant murmurs. Inside, a new reckoning gathered its breath. The announcement of the spring ball traveled through London like a perfumed promise, gilded and deliberate, as though Harrington House sought to drown rumor beneath orchestras and candlelight. Invitations were dispatched to titled families and influential patrons, each embossed card a declaration that Lord Harrington's standing remained unassailable. Yet beneath the polished veneer of preparation lay a question sharp as a blade. Would he retreat into convention, or would he advance toward the scandal he had vowed to confront? Eliza moved through the days preceding the event with disciplined restraint. Seamstresses arrived to adjust draperies and gowns. Florists filled the conservatory with hothouse roses whose fragrance hovered thick and intoxicating in the corridors. The servants whispered that the ball would mark a formal announcement, perhaps an advantageous engagement to please his formidable aunt. Eliza listened without comment, though each speculation tightened the invisible thread wound about her heart. If he chose safety, she would not fault him. She had always understood the mathematics of sacrifice. On the evening of the ball, chandeliers blazed like captive constellations, their crystal prisms scattering brilliance across silk bodices and polished boots. Music swelled from the quartet station near the grand staircase, violins threading anticipation through the air. Eliza wore her plain black uniform newly pressed, her hair arranged with severe neatness. She felt less a woman than a shadow tasked with preserving elegance for others. Lord Harrington descended the staircase at precisely 9. His attire was immaculate, his expression composed, yet there was an alertness in his bearing that suggested decision rather than compliance. Guests greeted him with measured enthusiasm, their smiles edged with curiosity. His aunt stood at his side, resplendent in amethyst satin, her fan flicking open and shut like a metronome marking propriety. "Tonight," she murmured to him, audible to none but the nearest observers, "you shall restore order." "Order," he replied evenly, "must first acknowledge truth." Her gaze sharpened. "Truth is a luxury for those without consequence." "And silence," he returned, "is a luxury I no longer possess." The first set commenced, couples assembling in careful symmetry. Eliza carried trays of champagne, her movements precise, her eyes lowered. Yet she sensed the shift in atmosphere as he crossed the floor, not toward the most eligible heiress present, but toward the periphery where she stood. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Fans stilled. The orchestra's tempo wavered. He halted before her, his shadow falling across her modest attire. For a heartbeat the room held its breath. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice resonant enough to reach the gallery, "you have served this household with unwavering integrity." Every syllable reverberated through the assembly. She felt heat rise beneath her collar, though her posture did not bend. I perform my duty, my lord. Duty, he replied, extending his hand, deserves recognition. Gasps rippled outward as he offered his arm. To dance with a servant in such company was not a breach, it was a proclamation. Eliza understood the cost more keenly than any spectator. Acceptance would tether him irrevocably to her fate. My lord, she whispered, barely moving her lips, this gesture cannot be undone. Nor can injustice, he answered softly. The orchestra, uncertain yet compelled, resumed its melody. She placed her hand upon his sleeve. The contact was chaste, formal, and devastating. They moved into the pattern of the dance, their steps aligned with the rigid choreography that society adored. Yet beneath the measured turns flowed something far less controlled. Defiance, vulnerability, and unspoken vow. Whispers swelled along the walls. Has he lost his senses? Is she the one? What audacity! His aunt advanced, her composure fracturing. This spectacle ends now, she hissed. He did not release Eliza's hand. It has only begun. You would discard generations for infatuation? I would preserve my honor. By embracing scandal? By acknowledging responsibility. The word struck like a struck bell. Responsibility did not belong in romantic discourse. It belonged in ledgers and estates. By invoking it here, he reframed the narrative from indulgence to accountability. Eliza felt the tremor in his arm, the tension he concealed from the crowd. She understood that courage was rarely free of fear. The dance concluded in a suspended silence more potent than applause. He guided her to the center of the room rather than back to the shadows. There will be no announcement of engagement tonight, he declared, addressing the assembly with composed clarity. There will be, instead, an acknowledgement. I have wronged a woman of this household by allowing her to bear alone what was never hers alone to bear. A collective intake of breath shuddered through the ballroom. Eliza's pulse roared in her ears. He did not detail their intimacy. He did not expose her further. Yet the implication shimmered unmistakably in the charged air. I will not permit her name to be diminished by whispers, he continued. If scandal must attach itself to someone, let it be to me. The declaration fractured the careful equilibrium of the evening. A gentleman abandoned his glass, a lady's fan slipped to the floor. His aunt's complexion blanched. You are condemning yourself, she said hoarsely. I am redeeming myself, he replied. Eliza's composure faltered for the first time. She had believed she could endure silent censure. She had not prepared for public allegiance. The choice before her sharpened with brutal clarity. To remain silent would allow him to shoulder disgrace unchallenged. To speak would bind them together before witnesses who would never forget. She stepped forward, her voice steadier than she felt. My lord's generosity exceeds necessity. I sought no rescue. He turned to her, his gaze unwavering. Then do not call it rescue. Call it partnership. The word hovered, radical and luminous. Partnership implied equality, an alignment unrecognized by the rigid architecture of class. The ballroom seemed suddenly smaller, its glittering excess inconsequential beside the magnitude of that offer. From the far end of the room, a voice cut through the murmurs. Is this to culminate in matrimony? The question, brazen and undeniable, settled like a gauntlet between them. All eyes fixed upon Lord Harrington. Eliza felt the weight of expectation press upon her shoulders, heavier than any burden she had previously borne. He did not hesitate. If she will consent. Silence thundered louder than the storm that had shaken the house nights before. In that suspended instant, Eliza understood that the future balanced not upon lineage or rumor, but upon her reply. Silence did not merely fall upon the ballroom. It crystallized, suspending every breath, every judgment, every calculation in a single fragile moment. Eliza felt the weight of 100 expectations pressing against her ribs, yet beneath that suffocating pressure something steadier began to rise. She had surrendered once to fear, choosing secrecy over scandal, erasure over exposure. She would not choose disappearance again. His gaze did not waver. In it she saw no command, no entitlement, only a willingness to stand where she stood, to endure what she endured. That, more than the grandeur of chandeliers or the scrutiny of titled guests, clarified her path. My lord, she said, her voice carrying farther than she anticipated, consent is not bestowed lightly. A murmur rippled through the assembly, some interpreting hesitation as refusal. His aunt's posture straightened, hope flickering across her sharpened features. Yet Eliza continued. Nor is it earned by sacrifice alone. It is earned by constancy. Lord Harrington inclined his head, as though accepting a challenge rather than an answer. "Then test me," he replied evenly. The exchange altered the tenor of the room. What had seemed impulsive now appeared deliberate, almost contractual. Eliza felt her pulse steady. "You would bind your name to mine," she said, knowing the whispers will not cease. "I would bind my name to truth," he answered. "And if society withdraws its favor?" "Favor is a fickle currency." "And affection?" she pressed softly. "Affection must survive more than defiance." A flicker of vulnerability crossed his features. "Affection survived silence. It will survive scrutiny." The simplicity of that admission disarmed her more completely than any flourish could have done. She understood then that he was not rescuing her. He was reclaiming himself. The distinction mattered. She turned, slowly, allowing her gaze to travel across the gathered faces: curiosity, disdain, fascination. These were the arbiters of reputation, the keepers of doors that opened or closed with lethal subtlety. For years she had moved invisibly among them, a shadow arranging their comforts. Now she stood illuminated. "I will not be an emblem of your rebellion," she said at last, her eyes returning to his. "If we proceed, it shall not be to scandalize, but to build." His expression softened into something resolute. "I have no interest in spectacle." "Nor I," she replied. The orchestra, uncertain and restless, resumed a hesitant melody, as though urging resolution. His aunt stepped forward, abandoning pretense. "Consider what you forfeit," she warned him. "Patronage, alliances, the esteem of men whose signatures sustain this estate." He faced her without hostility. "An estate sustained by cowardice is already diminished." The rebuke landed with quiet finality. Several guests averted their eyes. Others leaned forward, captivated by the unfolding breach of convention. Eliza drew a breath that seemed to gather the remnants of her former timidity and release them. "Then hear me plainly," she said. "If I accept, I do so not as penance for a past neither of us can reclaim, but as a partner in what may yet be shaped." He extended his hand once more, not as master, not as benefactor, but as equal. "Miss Eliza Hartwell, will you permit me to shape it beside you?" The use of her full name reverberated through the hall like a benediction. She felt the last tether of fear loosen within her. "I will," she answered. The words did not thunder. They settled, deliberate and irrevocable. A collective exhale coursed through the ballroom, some relieved, others scandalized. His aunt's fan slipped from her grasp and struck the marble floor with a brittle crack that echoed more loudly than any applause. Lord Harrington did not look toward the fallen fan. He drew Eliza's hand to his arm and addressed the assembly with composed authority. "There will be a ceremony," he said. "Modest, yet sufficient. Those who cannot in good conscience attend are absolved of obligation." It was not a plea, it was an invitation stripped of coercion. The distinction silenced further protest. One by one, guests began to disperse, their departures marked by restrained bows and unreadable expressions. The glitter of the evening dulled as carriages were summoned and doors closed behind them. When at last the ballroom emptied of all but family and a handful of loyal servants, the grandeur seemed less imposing, almost intimate. Eliza stood beside him beneath the fading blaze of chandeliers, aware that triumph bore its own gravity. This was no fairy tale consummated in applause, it was a recalibration of power that would reverberate beyond these walls. His aunt regarded them both with a gaze sharpened by decades of authority. "You believe love's sufficient armor," she said quietly. "It is not." "No," he agreed. "But integrity is." She studied him for a long moment, then inclined her head, not in approval but in acknowledgement. "Then pray you possess enough." With that, she withdrew, her footsteps receding into the corridor like the retreat of an era reluctant to concede. Left alone in the vast room, Eliza felt the enormity of what they had chosen. "You have altered the course of your life," she murmured. "So have you. Do you regret it?" He considered her carefully. "I regret only the weeks in which you bore fear alone." The honesty of the confession stirred a warmth that steadied her more effectively than any reassurance. "Then let us bear what follows together," she said. He lifted her hand to his lips, not in ostentation but in reverence. The gesture sealed their accord more profoundly than the public declaration had done. Outside, the first light of dawn began to edge the sky, pale and tentative. The ball had stretched into morning without their notice, as though the night itself had paused to witness their defiance. Through the tall windows, London stirred, unaware that within Harrington House an old order had shifted. A servant entered discreetly to extinguish the remaining candles. As the flames dwindled one by one, the room surrendered its brilliance, leaving only the soft glow of new day. In that gentler light, the gulf of class appeared less absolute, the barriers less immutable. Eliza regarded him not as master but as man. "There will be resistance," she said. "There will," he agreed. "There will be invitations rescinded. Undoubtedly. And moments when doubt returns." He smiled faintly. "Then we shall confront them as we did tonight, without retreat." The certainty in his voice did not erase the trials ahead, but it rendered them navigable. She sensed that the true test of their union would not be the scandal of the present, but the endurance of the future. He guided her toward the staircase, no longer concerned with hidden corridors or watchful eyes. Each step they ascended felt less like escape and more like ascent into a reality of their own choosing. At the landing he paused, studying her as though committing the moment to memory. "You are no longer alone," he said quietly. For the first time since the night she had entered the physician's discreet carriage, she believed it fully. The shame that had once defined her seemed distant, almost unreal, eclipsed by the clarity of this dawn. Below them, the grand doors of Harrington House opened to admit the morning air. Somewhere beyond, carriages would carry tales of scandal through drawing rooms and clubs. Some would condemn, some would admire, all would remember. But within the threshold of that house, beneath a sky brightening with untested promise, two figures stood aligned not by accident, nor by impulse but by choice. And in that deliberate choice lay a quiet revolution more enduring than rumor.